Thomas Kinkade is the best artist of the 20th century. Hot take. At least that's my opinion. Thomas Kinkade died in 2012. And if you're not familiar with his art, just Google it and you will probably recognize it in some form or fashion if you're from around these here parts. In 2012, The Guardian had this to say about Kinkade. Who could have imagined that behind so many contented visions of peace, harmony, and nauseating goodness lay just another story of deception, disappointment, and depravity, fueled by those ever-ready stooges, Valium and alcohol. The blogger Mockingbird from mbird.com had this to say of Kinkade and his work. The dilemma of Kinkade's art is that he sweeps human suffering under the rug. It sees the world through a pre-fall lens. His paintings are a big fat lie. And I have to wonder if the dishonesty actually contributed to his personal suffering more than it helped. In other words, what would have happened if Kinkade had struggled with his pain in his art rather than painting a facade over the human predicament? Chances are, though, hypothetical Kinkade paintings that came from a place of suffering would never have sold millions like the real Kinkades did, and still do. And here's one more. Kinkade's work is the meticulously painted smile on the Joker's disfigured face. It refuses to deal with fallenness, brokenness, sinfulness of the world. And more troubling, it enables his clientele to escape into an imaginary world where things can be pretty good. As long as we have our faith, our family values, and visual imagery that reaffirms all this at the office and at home, that Kinkade and his followers believe to be Christian art is an affront to art. Now, I want to be clear. I am no art aficionado. I have never had art speak to me until Thomas Kinkade. I didn't even know that he had died or by what causes until recently. But early last year, I was alone in this studio, and I had gone through a very painful loss in my life, and I was trying to deal with it through therapy. And after, or maybe during a session, I had this kind of platonic vision of form of a Kinkade cabin scene come into my mind. I could see the cabin covered in snow, and it was dusk, and there was gray, coldness all around, and I saw an old me looking at the house. Maybe it was mine. Maybe my family was in it, in its warm glow, and warmth and merriness and brightness. My family lived there. But I realized that for a time, I had not. I did not inhabit that space. I could visit, but I could not stay because my shame told me that I belonged outside. And what it would take to live in that house, to receive that warmth, that intimacy, was vulnerability. It was honesty. It would have to be truth. Even though the idyllic cabin seemed so inviting, I knew that my place was always outside, around the campfire, a lonely existence, warm enough to stay alive, but not actually living. And I realized this had been my existence. And I now saw it as the existence of maybe people I loved. And that I did now live in the cabin, in true intimacy with people that I cared about, in peace. And I had to accept for people that were not in the house, it would be their choice whether or not to come in. I could come out and sit by the fire with them, visit them, care about them, even invite them in, so to speak. But that was maybe the difference of what life was like for some. Some of us come into the house while others are still outside at the campfire, and maybe even in the woods. Initially, I did not think about Thomas Kinkade in this frame. I was just seeing through my own interpretive lens, and it was meaningful. And I credit Pageau for this symbolic insight that I have come to find more available and more accessible from my subconscious into my real life. I shared this with my wife and my therapist, but the idea stuck with me. And I wondered if there was a Thomas Kinkade painting out there that my platonic vision could closely match up to. And this was what I found. I had lived outside in the cold for a season of my life. Before truth, I even almost lost the privilege to be near this place. And I recognized that people live outside these idyllic homes all the time. That even if that is their family inside, they are not at home there. They are more at home on the outside. So fast forward a few months, I'm sharing this insight with my sister, who is an actual artist. And she said, Christian, you know how Thomas Kinkade died, right? Like how tragic it was, that it was from addiction and he OD'd. I said, no. And in that moment, I had an even deeper insight into all of his art. I realized that to the best that I could recollect, all his paintings were always images from the outside, looking at a place he wished he could be a part of. That others were a part of it, but he was not. He never belonged. And I was overcome by the sadness of his life and the actual sadness of his art after all. The warm glow and the idyllic settings of the cabins and the countrysides were ones that he was an observer of, but not one that he could actually inhabit. One that he was never a part of. An outsider looking in. I've searched to try to find if there was a painting that he had made where he was in community, in the warmth, in the cabins, in the homes, but all I could find were art of him looking into these spaces, longing to be a part of them, but never in them. After his death, Thomas Kinkade's brother had this to say. My brother was a good man, he said, pausing as he choked up along with much of his mostly middle-aged and older audience. The tragedy of my brother is he eventually fell to his own humanity. The triumph of my brother is that his art was never touched by that tragedy. His art was affirmation that there was hope, there was beauty, and a statement of love that wasn't touched by this. His brother is wrong. His paintings were touched by Kinkade's suffering. Kinkade's perspective was always one of longing to be in the warmth and intimacy and the cozy connection of love, but that he was never a part of it. And that is pain. That is suffering. To never be able to bring his dreams into his real life. Many of us live outside the cabins and homes, and many of us still do. The Mockingbird blogger closes with this. As a Christian with evangelical, small e leanings myself, I am mostly saddened by Kinkade's story because I know evangelicalism helped him perpetuate his lie. Christians often want to ignore the darkness of sin, but I, for one, find consolation in the art that explores the dark places with honesty. It strikes a chord, showing me I'm not alone. It's counterintuitive, perhaps, but such art gives me hope and often helps me to heal. I wish Kinkade could have gone there too. He didn't, but there's a place for honesty, for honest art created by and or appreciated by Christians. For now, maybe Kinkade's life story can serve as something as a cautionary tale about what happens when Christians demand just the clean stuff. We might instead be surprised to find more comfort in artists who bear their cross and create from a place of suffering. I believe that Kinkade did create from a place of suffering, not from a place of healing. You know, and I see where she's coming from, but that's a very harsh judgment. And I understand the frustrations. I've looked at Christian art like movies and felt the same thing. Those that feel inauthentic like Hallmark films, etc. But there is accuracy to her insight. It is short-sighted, but I think that Thomas Kinkade was a product of the whole spiritual bypass culture that I've found many times in Christianity. There's been this culture where people do not want to do the long and messy work of dealing with emotional suffering. We can just say, I'll pray for you, and the person can just go to the altar 100 times and pray it away to God. But no one wants to deal with the addiction, the betrayals, the despair directly. Rather, we settle just to look at the pretty painting and say, look how spiritual that person is. Look how talented they are, when that person may be suffering. But because they look good, that's all that matters. The image is all that matters. Not what the image may be saying or what it truly represents. Thomas Kinkade was honest about his suffering in his paintings, and it spoke directly to suffering that I had experienced and that I see others experience in my life. And in the decadent excesses of Western modernity and the spiritual bypass that infects Christianity with the inability to be authentic and find true intimacy with people that they want to love more deeply. Spiritual bypass of a whole generation, unable to look at suffering of the individual. Because, no, we must bypass this sickness or pain. Just do the surgery, but never face it directly with a change of pattern, a habit, or take responsibility. And as far as the Jordan Peterson sphere, I think he spoke directly to this. And I think that people that resonate with him were a lot of people that were suffering. A kind of emotional, deep suffering. Many Christians, even like myself, that had the right image, but a broken heart in a culture that demanded the image without the heart. I'll end with a quote from Thomas Kinkade himself. Speaking of his paintings, it's not the world we live in, it's the world we wished we lived in. People wish they could find that stream, that cabin in the woods.